The largest civilization on Earth vanished without a battle. No invasion, no plague, no famine that left bodies in the streets. Archaeologists have spent 100 years looking for the catastrophe, and they keep finding the same thing. Nothing. Empty cities, intact infrastructure, streets that still follow their grid, drainage channels that still run in the right direction, and 44 skeletons scattered across a city that once held 40,000 people, none of them killed by violence, none of them buried in mass graves, none of them showing the biological signature of epidemic disease. The city wasn't destroyed, it was left. At its peak, this civilization was larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It maintained identical construction standards across a territory the size of Western Europe for 700 years, without a single identified king, a single royal tomb, a single monument to individual power. Its cities had running water and sewage systems that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 19th century. And then, around 1900 BCE, the cities emptied. Not overnight, not in fire. Slowly, deliberately, over the course of roughly 2 centuries, the population simply walked away from the greatest urban infrastructure the ancient world had ever built. We don't know why. We don't know who decided. We don't even know what they called themselves, because they left behind a script that no one, in 4,000 years, has ever been able to read. The official explanation is climate change, shifting monsoons, drying rivers, a civilization that had no choice. But in 2018, a survey of 1,400 Harappan sites revealed something that doesn't fit that explanation. The timeline is wrong. The sequence is wrong. And the pattern left in the sediment suggests that what happened to the Indus Valley Civilization wasn't a collapse driven by catastrophe. It was a decision. That survey, and what it reveals about the most orderly disappearance in human history, is in Act 4. In 1924, John Marshall published a photograph in the Illustrated London News. It showed a drain. Not a temple, not a throne, not a weapon. A drain, cut from fired brick, sealed with bitumen mortar, designed to carry wastewater away from a residential street and into a covered main channel running beneath the city. Marshall, who was Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, described it in technical language that didn't hide his astonishment. He was looking at a municipal sanitation system more sophisticated than anything built in Europe before the 19th century. The city was Mohenjo-Daro. The drain was approximately 4,500 years old. What Marshall had found wasn't a curiosity. It was a system. Every house in the excavated sectors had a bathing platform, a raised, watertight floor sloped to direct water into a wall outlet. That outlet connected to a street drain. The street drain connected to a covered collector.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
The collector ran to the edge of the city. The entire sequence was engineered with a consistency that required centralized planning, standardized brick dimensions, and a municipal authority capable of enforcing construction codes across an urban area of approximately 250 hectares. Standardized brick dimensions. That detail doesn't sound remarkable until you check the numbers. Across every Harappan site excavated, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, more than 1,000 settlements spanning territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, the bricks share the same ratio, 1 to 2 to 4. Length, width, height. Every city, every site. Over a territory of roughly 1.5 million square kilometers, for 700 years. No pharaoh issued that decree. No known emperor enforced it. There is no palace at Mohenjo-Daro, no throne room, no monument to a king. And yet someone, or something, maintained construction standards across a civilization the size of Western Europe for 7 centuries without a single identified ruler. According to archaeologist Jonathan Mark Knoyer of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose excavations at Harappa span 4 decades, the absence of monumental royal architecture is not a gap in the record. It is the record. The Harappans did not build to glorify individuals. They built to function. Their largest structures were granaries and public baths, infrastructure, not monuments. A civilization without kings that outlasted every contemporary empire. And here is the detail that Marshall's 1924 article did not address, because no one thought to ask it yet. The drainage system at Mohenjo-Daro was not maintained in its final centuries. The later construction layers show pipes blocked, channels filled in, buildings subdivided. The infrastructure was degrading, but the city was still occupied. The people stayed while the system failed around them. The official estimate puts the population of Mohenjo-Daro at 40,000. The drainage infrastructure was built for twice that. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was there. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after the first major site identified, emerged around 3300 BCE in what is now Pakistan, northwest India, and Afghanistan. By 2600 BCE, it had reached its mature phase. By 2500 BCE, it was the largest civilization on Earth, larger than Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, larger than both combined. At its peak, the Harappan world covered approximately 1.5 million square kilometers and included more than 1,000 settlements, from small villages to fully planned cities with grid-patterned streets, multi-story buildings, and public water infrastructure that no contemporary civilization came close to matching. Mohenjo-Daro in the south, Harappa in the Punjab, Dholavira in the Rann of Kutch, built on an island and supplied by an elaborate rainwater harvesting system. Rakhigarhi, recently re-excavated, now believed to be the largest Harappan city of all. These were not tribal settlements. They were cities in the full administrative sense, planned before construction began, built to specifications, maintained over generations. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro run on a cardinal grid. The residential blocks are uniform. The Great Bath, a watertight tank of fired brick and bitumen, 12 meters long, 7 wide, nearly 3 deep, sits at the center of the Citadel Mound. Its function still debated, but its engineering beyond dispute. It held water. It was designed to hold water. Someone decided that holding water, in that place, at that scale, mattered enough to build it. The people who built it left no mythology we can read, no creation story, no pantheon with names attached. What they left are seals, small carved stones, typically soapite, bearing images of animals, humans, and a script that has resisted every attempt at decipherment for 100 years. Approximately 4,000 seals have been recovered. The script appears on seals, pottery, and tablets. It has between 400 and 600 distinct signs. It has never been translated. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We know what their drains looked like. The standard account of what happened next is, on its surface, coherent. Around 1900 BCE, the climate changed. The monsoon patterns that had sustained agriculture across the Indus Basin shifted eastward. The rivers that fed the cities, including the now dry Ghaggar Hakra, identified by many scholars as the ancient Sarasvati of Vedic texts, began to fail. Without reliable water, the agricultural surplus that sustained urban populations collapsed. People moved. Cities were abandoned. The civilization dispersed into smaller rural settlements across the Gangetic Plain to the east, where the monsoon still reached. Drought, migration, dispersal. It is a clean story. It has the logic of necessity. You can teach it in 40 minutes. The Smithsonian Magazine ran it in 2012. National Geographic repeated it in 2016. It appears in virtually every undergraduate textbook on ancient civilizations published in the last 30 years. What the official record confirms, and what no one thought to check carefully until recently, is buried in the same sediment cores everyone cited to build the climate model. The cores show the drought. That part is real. What they also show is something about the timing that doesn't quite fit the narrative as written. The civilization didn't vanish when the drought peaked. It vanished before. And that sequence, drought arrives, cities empty, populations move east, turns out to have the order slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to notice in a textbook summary. Wrong enough to matter if you're trying to understand what actually happened. There is a site, a specific excavation layer. Block 7 of the DKG section at Mohenjo-Daro, excavated in the 1960s and reanalyzed in the 1990s. And then there's the report from Mohenjo-Daro, Block 7, Excavation Layer 5. Vanished. That's the word in the title. Archaeologists use a more careful word. They say de-urbanization. The difference between those two words is the entire argument. Block 7, DKG section, Mohenjo-Daro. Excavation Layer 5. When archaeologist George Dales re-examined this section in the 1960s and 1970s, he was looking at the final occupation phase of the city, the last people who lived there before it was abandoned. What he found contradicted the invasion hypothesis that had dominated Harappan scholarship since the 1940s. Dales published his findings in 1964 in a paper titled The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-Daro in the journal Expedition. The title was not subtle. The massacre hadn't happened. The skeletal remains that Sir Mortimer Wheeler had identified in the 1940s as evidence of violent conquest, the basis for his Aryan invasion theory, which held that Indo-European migrants destroyed the Harappan cities by force, were not massacre victims. Dales counted them. 44 individuals, across a city that had housed tens of thousands. They were found in different layers, different periods, different contexts. Some showed signs of disease. Some showed no trauma at all. There was no mass grave, no burned layer, no weapons stockpile consistent with siege or defense. 44 skeletons in a city of 40,000 people. That is not a massacre. That is a normal archaeological scatter across centuries of occupation. Wheeler's invasion theory had been the dominant explanation for Harappan decline for 3 decades. It appeared in textbooks. It was taught in universities. It shaped how an entire generation of scholars framed the question. And it was built on 44 skeletons that Dales demonstrated, with field evidence, did not support the conclusion Wheeler had drawn from them. The invasion theory was quietly retired. The climate model replaced it. Which brings us to the sequencing problem. In 2012, a team led by geologist Liviu Giosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The study used satellite imaging, sediment coring, and geomorphological analysis to reconstruct the river systems of the Indus Basin over a period of 10,000 years. It was the most comprehensive hydrological reconstruction of the region ever attempted. The findings were specific. The Ghaggar-Hakra River System, the one whose decline is cited as the primary driver of Harappan collapse, had already weakened significantly before the urban phase of the civilization began. The large Himalayan-fed rivers that some earlier models assumed fed the Ghaggar Hakra had in fact shifted their courses much earlier, around 4000 to 3000 BCE. By the time Mohenjo-Daro was at its peak, the river system was already reduced to a monsoon-fed seasonal flow. The civilization built its greatest cities after the rivers were already declining, not before, after. This doesn't disprove climate as a factor. Giosan's team was careful about that. The monsoon weakening in the post-2000 BCE period was real, and it likely made the eastern agricultural zones more attractive than the drying western core. Migration eastward is documented in the archaeological record. Smaller rural settlements in the Gangetic Plain increase in number precisely as the large Indus cities depopulate. But the timeline no longer supports a civilization destroyed by sudden environmental catastrophe. What it supports is a civilization that had been managing environmental stress for centuries, and at some point stopped managing it from cities. The question is, why that decision was made when it was made. Because the cities weren't destroyed. They were left. The infrastructure was degrading, yes. The population was declining, yes. But the archaeological record at Mohenjo-Daro shows continued occupation through the degradation. People living in smaller structures, subdividing older buildings, maintaining some functions while others lapsed. This is not the pattern of a population fleeing. It is the pattern of a population winding down. Organized, deliberate, slow. There's a survey, published in 2018 by researchers at IIT Kharagpur and the Archaeological Survey of India, using satellite data and sediment analysis across the full extent of the Harappan cultural zone. It mapped settlement patterns across 1,400 sites over a period of 1,000 years. What it found doesn't fit the climate model. Not even close. The 2018 IIT Kharagpur study, published in Nature Communications by lead author Nishant Malik and a team of climate scientists and archaeologists, did something no previous study had done at scale. It mapped not just where Harappan settlements were, but when they were occupied, when they were abandoned, and in which direction the population moved. Site by site, across 1,400 locations, over 1,000 years. The pattern it revealed was not chaos. It was not collapse. It was a gradient. The large urban centers in the western core, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, the cities along the Indus and the dried Ghaggar Hakra corridor, depopulated first, and slowly, beginning around 1900 BCE. But simultaneously, settlement density in the eastern zones, the upper Gangetic Plain, the foothills of the Himalayas, the regions of what is now Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, increased. The population didn't disappear. It relocated. And the relocation followed a pattern consistent with deliberate movement toward zones of higher and more reliable rainfall. This is not what a collapsing civilization looks like. A collapsing civilization leaves mass graves, burned settlements, abandoned grain stores, evidence of disease or starvation. The Harappan record has almost none of these. What it has is 1,000 years of gradual, directional population movement, away from a drying core, toward a wetter periphery, executed without any identifiable central authority coordinating it. According to Upinder Singh, professor of history at Ashoka University and author of A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India, 2008, the Harappan transition represents one of the most orderly large-scale demographic shifts in the ancient world. She does not use the word collapse. Almost no serious Harappan scholar does anymore. The textbooks haven't caught up. And this is where it gets interesting. Because if the movement was orderly, if it was, in some sense, managed, then the question of who managed it becomes unavoidable. And that question leads directly back to the thing that has puzzled archaeologists since Marshall's first excavations: the complete absence of identifiable political authority in the Harappan world. No palaces, no royal tombs, no monuments to rulers, no iconography of kingship, no images of a figure dominating others, no scenes of military victory, no symbols of centralized divine authority of the kind that saturate Egyptian and Mesopotamian visual culture of the same period. What Harappan seals show, repeatedly, is a figure seated in what appears to be a yogic posture, surrounded by animals. Scholars call it the Pashupati seal, a possible proto-Shiva figure, a lord of animals. It appears on multiple seals across multiple sites. It is not a king receiving tribute. It is not a general commanding troops. Whatever authority it represents, it is not the authority of conquest. Jonathan Mark Knoyer has argued for decades that Harappan society may have been governed not by a single centralized ruler, but by an elite of merchants, ritual specialists, and craft leaders. A distributed authority structure that maintained cohesion through shared standards, shared symbols, and shared infrastructure, rather than through coercive power. A civilization held together not by a throne, but by a drainage system. And if that is true, if the coherence of the Harappan world was horizontal rather than vertical, distributed rather than centralized, then the collapse looks entirely different. There was no throne to fall, no dynasty to end, no capital to sack. When the environmental calculus shifted, the distributed network simply reoriented. The cities that had been useful were no longer useful. The people who had lived in them moved to where the rains still fell. It wasn't a death. It was a decision. 44 skeletons. That number keeps coming back. In a city that may have housed 40,000 people at its peak, 44 individuals were found in the final occupation layers. Some were elderly. Some showed signs of illness. One was a child. They were not killed. They were not buried with ceremony. They were simply found, in streets, in rooms, in the positions of people who had stopped moving. The rest of the city was empty. Not burned, not looted, or rather, looted slowly, over generations, as later populations quarried the fired brick for their own construction. The objects left behind were not valuables dropped in flight. They were the things people chose not to carry. The heavy things, the worn things, the things that had served their purpose. Someone packed. Someone decided what to take and what to leave. Someone walked out of a city that their grandparents had been born in, and their grandparents before them, and they did not look back. Or if they did, we have no record of it. The script they left behind has never been read. We have 4,000 seals. We have the signs. We have the impressions left in clay by hands that held them 4,000 years ago. And we cannot hear a single word. The greatest civilization of the ancient world left in silence. And the silence is still there. The Harappan civilization did not end. It dissolved into everything that came after it. The population that moved east into the Gangetic Plain didn't vanish into the archaeological record. It merged with it. The rural settlements that replaced the urban centers carried Harappan ceramic traditions, Harappan weight systems, Harappan craft techniques. The cities stopped. The people continued. And the culture they carried with them seeded what would eventually become, over the following millennium, the foundational layer of South Asian civilization. Some scholars now argue that the Harappan dispersal is the missing demographic event that explains the early Vedic period. That the population moving east from the Indus core was the population among whom the earliest Sanskrit hymns were composed and transmitted. Not invaders arriving from outside. Not a conquered people replaced by newcomers. The same people, moving through their own landscape, carrying their knowledge with them in a form that required no brick, no seal, no drainage channel to survive. Oral tradition. The most durable infrastructure the Harappans may have built was the one that left no archaeological trace at all. This matters now in ways that are not abstract. The Harappan transition is the earliest well-documented example in human history of a large urban civilization successfully, if that word applies, reorganizing itself in response to sustained climate stress. Not collapsing, reorganizing. The cities that depended on a specific hydrological regime were abandoned when that regime shifted. The population moved toward resilience. The knowledge survived. We are currently watching coastal cities absorb the first serious impacts of sea level rise. We are watching agricultural zones in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and the American Southwest experience the kind of multi-decade precipitation shifts that the Harappan core experienced after 2000 BCE. The policy conversation around these shifts is almost entirely framed around preservation. How do we save the cities? How do we maintain the infrastructure? How do we hold the population in place? The Harappans asked a different question. Or perhaps they didn't ask it at all. Perhaps the decision was so distributed, so gradual, so embedded in 10,000 individual choices made over 2 centuries that no one ever framed it as a decision. The city just became, slowly, a place where fewer people lived. And then a place where almost no one lived. And then a place where 44 people remained, for reasons we will never know. There is one more thing. The Harappan script, those 4,000 undeciphered seals, is not simply a linguistic puzzle. It is an active gap in our understanding of how this civilization thought about itself. Every other major ancient civilization left us a self-portrait in language. Egyptian cosmology, Mesopotamian law codes, Chinese oracle bones, Vedic hymns. The Harappans left us their plumbing and their silence. We know what they built. We do not know what they believed. We know how their water moved through their cities. We do not know what they called the world. And because we cannot read them, every interpretation of their civilization, including this one, is built on inference, on artifact, on the negative space where the words should be. The scholars who say they collapsed are inferring. The scholars who say they adapted are inferring. The honest position is that we are reconstructing a civilization from its objects, and the people who made those objects are not here to correct us. That absence is not a detail. It is the whole story. A civilization so coherent, it maintained identical brick ratios across 1.5 million square kilometers for 700 years. And we cannot read a single sentence they wrote. We have a word for what the Harappans did. We call it failure. We call it collapse, decline, dissolution. Words that place the judgment on the civilization rather than on the frame we use to evaluate it. A civilization that stops producing monumental architecture is assumed to have stopped mattering. A city that empties is assumed to have been defeated. A script that goes unread is assumed to have said nothing worth hearing. But consider what the record actually shows. A society that built without kings, that maintained coherence across a territory larger than any contemporary empire without a single identified ruler, a single royal tomb, a single monument to individual power, that responded to centuries of environmental stress, not with war, not with the kind of desperate consolidation that produces empires and massacres, but with movement. Slow, distributed, apparently voluntary movement toward survival. And then disappeared so completely from the historical memory of the civilizations that followed, that we spent 100 years assuming it had been destroyed by someone else, because we couldn't imagine a civilization choosing to end its cities rather than defend them. The Harappan script will likely be deciphered in our lifetime. Computational approaches, the same machine learning tools now being applied to Linear A, to Proto-Elamite, to other undeciphered systems, are making progress on sign frequency, sign distribution, and contextual clustering that purely human analysis could not achieve at scale. We may, within a generation, know what those seals say. And when we do, we may discover that the silence was not empty, that it was full of something we didn't have the tools to hear. There is a version of the Harappan story that is deeply uncomfortable for the modern world, and it is this. The civilization that lasted longest, spread furthest, and left the most durable cultural inheritance of any society in the ancient world was the one that built no army, crowned no king, and walked away from its cities when the cities stopped working. Every civilization we celebrate, Rome, Egypt, Babylon, we celebrate partly because of how it fell. The drama of collapse, the tragedy of hubris meeting consequence. We have built an entire framework of historical meaning around the idea that great civilizations end in fire. The Harappans ended in footsteps. 44 people left behind in a city built for 40,000. No fire, no conquest, no final inscription. Just the sound of people leaving, and then, eventually, silence. We don't know if they knew what they were doing. We don't know if anyone, standing at the edge of Mohenjo-Daro for the last time, understood that they were the last. But the city is still there. The drains still run beneath the dust. The bricks are still in ratio. And the seals are still waiting. 4,000 voices in a language no living person has ever spoken aloud. If the greatest civilization of the ancient world vanished without a single word we can read, what else are we getting wrong about the people who built this world? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the island where 7 men rewrote the rules of money and made sure no one would find out for decades. The drains outlasted the dynasty, because there was no dynasty, only the work.